Thanks for joining us for our second week. Today is just going to be kind of a deeper dive into kind of understanding the neurobiology of really like a lot more about the why and how experience ends up informing physiology and brain structure and things like that. So a little bit of review from last week if you were with us last week, and then a bit of a deeper dive to hopefully, I don't know, build a better understanding of what is happening. So here we go. You ready? Here we go. All right. On to the Zoom meeting. All right. So this is where we're at today. Let me just get my screen set up so I can see people still. All right. So the goals for today, we really want to, so much of the takeaways from this book really have to do with a distance between what the developing neurobiology expects and what it experiences, right? So when we think about capacity building, when we think about protective factors, when we think about how to mitigate the impact or prevent trauma in our environment, I think from my perspective, so much of it has to do with really understanding what are these kind of species expectant experiences, and we'll create a common language for that. And how do we just meet them, right? To be able to evaluate the distance between what we expect and what we experience, and how do we minimize that distance? So a lot of this has to do with deprivation and threat. Deprivation and threat exist as two distinct features of environmental experience, but they're often overlapping, right? And so from a scientific perspective, it's really, really hard to parse these things out in terms of the specific impacts of the neurobiology because they're so often intertwined. But when you think about, again, the experience, deprivation, and threat, kind of in the arc of the developing nervous system, right? The developing nervous system is really, really sensitive to a lot of these factors. And so that starts to inform then stress responses, and we'll just do a quick pass of the ACEs study, and then end with a call to action because we got to do something, right? That's our job. All right, so I want everybody on the call to take a minute and think about, if you're with somebody, you can talk with that person. If you're on your own, you can jot some notes or just put in some kind of quick memories or whatever into the chat. Take a minute to think about and talk about just what are some of, like, right? We all have these really great, like, what are some of the best memories that you can think of from childhood? Who was there? What were you doing? And how did it feel? All right, we call these like 30-second essays, right? So if you just take 30 seconds to write some stuff down, again, if you're with somebody, feel free to be like, oh, this really amazing thing happened. All right, so does anybody, right? This is like, we're talking about like internet and academic courage here. Does anyone want to just press their space bar really quick and share a quick story? I know everybody's like, oh, no, not me. I see you, Tim and Danielle up there. All right, safer then. Put it in a chat. How did it feel, right? We don't need to worry about the details of the experience. What do those really good memories feel like? And Sarah, if you can monitor the chat and just report things up.
Yeah, we got special and loved. Some of the experiences were catching lightning bugs. For her birthday, her mother would make her whatever food she wanted, hitting a grand slam, Sunday dinners with grandparents. Other feelings were very exciting, carefree, safe and secure, carefree like time was not present, happy moments.
All right, so this is a really good list, right? And I don't know if I stopped the share. I learned that when I was teaching online at the beginning of the semester. Stop your share if you ever want a chance for people to see what you're writing. So good memories, right? We feel special, we feel loved. People take time to make the things, right? In terms of like food is a big love language. Sharing is a way that humans very atypically compared to all other species, we share with non-kin. We want, right? Like that's how we show and demonstrate love and affection. this idea of lightning bugs. Not only do we have the time and the carefree, but we're outside. It's probably late in the summertime, so it's warm and we're probably in bare feet, right? Like all these things, right? This general feeling of happiness, right? And so if we're thinking about our physiology, what does that feel like? What is happiness, right? What does happiness feel like? How are our shoulders? Up high, down low.
Low.
Low, right? So this is physiology now.
Someone said relaxed.
Low shoulders, relax, right? Do we have knots in our tummy, or are we like pretty like kind of overall, like our blood pressure is high or low?
Low.
Low. Our heart rate is high or low?
Low.
Low. Blood pressure, low. Heart rate, low, right? So this idea, right? And we'll revisit again in terms of attachment circuitry, right? All of these feelings put us at rest, right? And a lot of these feelings are driven by, for you guys to see what I'm doing, I need to share my screen again. Here we go. Okay, is that better? Ta-da! Okay. A lot of these feelings, right? These feelings of being loved, these feelings of being safe, these feelings of being happy, right? Low stress, relaxed body are driven by this sense of social safety, right? So for a developing nervous system, for mammals, we are completely dependent on others to make it out of infancy, right? We do not survive without constant and consistent care from other people around us. And that safety then, right? That constant and consistent care, this is an evolutionary, I believe, very old, it's considered a neuropeptide. It's a very, very small neurotransmitter communicator in the brain called oxytocin. And oxytocin is released in the brain across central circuits and is really the what we understand as the neurobiological basis for this sense of feelings like trust and belonging and altruism. So it's really, really powerful in its impact on neural circuitry. And any time that we are engaged in kind of this positive affiliative behavior, oxytocin is far reaching in terms of the different brain circuitry that it communicates with. So it's produced in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for all of what we can call homeostatic function, or kind of like normal body balance type things like heart rate and blood pressure, how thirsty we feel, right? Those are all monitored by the hypothalamus, okay? And it's released, oxytocin is then released all across different parts of the brain to parts of the brain, there's part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. That's really, really important in reward valuing. The amygdala is really important in emotional, what's called emotional salient. So how much we pay attention to something in the environment. Lateral septum has to do with more anger, aggressive type behaviors. Hippocampus, anterior cingulate, ventral pallidum, different areas of the brain having to do with learning and memory, reward processing, long-term behavior and goal setting, and whether or not we sit still or move around, explore, or run away, right? So if you think about the way that oxytocin can modulate, right? And oxytocin doesn't necessarily activate and turn all of these parts of the brain on, but it modulates the circuitry. So that if you think about, right, what kinds of, if we are feeling this way, if we are feeling loved, if we are feeling special, if we are feeling that people are taking the time to appreciate us, are we on high stress and high alert? No. Right? Do we feel threatened in our current environment? Generally not, right? Do we feel reinforced, right? Is there kind of like this internal sense of like, ooh, yeah, I'm gonna do this again, right? This feels good. So those feelings of trust and altruism are driven by oxytocin, but there's another really powerful neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is responsible for what we call behavioral reinforcement, right? So when dopamine is released in large amounts across the neural circuitry, that's the neurobiological signal to say, do that again. So when you have oxytocin and dopamine on board at the same time, and by the way, there's really never a chance inside of the brain for oxytocin to be around and dopamine not to be around, right? They seem to be present together. And if you, a lot of the places, right, nucleus accumbens, amygdala, frontal cortex, a lot of the places, right, they overlap in their communication. So these two neurotransmitters not only set the stage for these feelings of being loved, these feelings of feeling happy, but also this really, really powerful, right? We always talk about how humans are a social species, right? We talk about how we can't get by without other humans, right? Again, we're gonna discuss the distance also that exists these days, but it's because of the overlap between oxytocin and dopamine. When dopamine comes on board as part of these affiliative behaviors, as part of these acts of community and friendship, that dopamine signal says, do this again. So we have these feelings and it's being reinforced neurobiologically in our brains. Okay. This is in the context of the developed brain, right? And so I want to revisit some of the things that we discussed last week in terms of the developing brain, right? The brain for humans is born remarkably neurobiologically immature, right? We looked at this last week where we have the age down here along the x-axis in years. So starting with the age of 0, 1, 3, 5, a little break in the graph, and then we start counting by decades. Okay. Brain weight in grams, just think about it as weight. You don't have to know the metric system, right? About 350 grams at birth. By the time we're 5 years old, about 1,200 grams, right? So the brain more than triples in its weight, right? Again, this is weight. In the first 5 years of life, which indicates a significant amount of neural development, right? And we talked about, well, if you think about what an infant can do, right? What can an infant do?
Cry.
Cry, right? That's it. And that's all an infant can do. An infant can cry, right? But over the first 5 years of life, if you think about all of the skills and all of the abilities and modes of communication that children are able to do, right, that they develop between the age of 0 and 5, right? All of that skill development, there's a change in neural architecture that underlies that skill development, right? And so we talked about, right, when neurons are born, at the time that a baby is born, those little neurons are like itty bitty sapling neurons, right? And through these constant exchanges with their environments, those neurons learn largely through social interaction what behaviors are reinforced, what behaviors are ignored, what behaviors are punished, right? And that's how we begin to develop the way, right, this very specific connections in the brain, synapses, that begin to drive our future behavior, right? Kind of the prerequisite neural architecture is driven by these kind of constant exchanges with our environment. So this was called dendritic arborization, synaptic proliferation, right? Those things drive a large part of this growth, of this just kind of mass increase over the first many years of life. And we have in the nervous system these things called structure-function relationships. And I have this picture here. We don't actually show pictures of actual neurons very often, but this is an actual neuron that lives in the frontal cortex. This picture came from a mouse, but ours are very similar. So we have the cell body down. Can you guys see the mouse, the little arrow pointer when I share my screen? Okay, awesome. So here's the cell body here, and you can see on this neuron, there are lots and lots and lots of branches, right? So there are these main big branches, but then those branches branch some more. And what's really cool is you can see these little like sticks or twig-like structures, right? Those are called dendritic spines. And want to hear the coolest thing you might hear all day? I'm giving myself a lot of credit for this one. I think it's going to be the coolest thing, right? That this is the site that we understand to be the site of learning and memory. So if you remember anything tomorrow that you didn't know today, it's because you have a physically new structure in your brain that didn't exist before, right? So we have this tremendous capacity for this principle of plasticity, this ability for our brain to change with learning and with experience, right? And this plasticity then that underlies this massive, massive arborization and proliferation of connections in the brain. But no matter how old we get, we always have the capacity to change our brain. And one of the most remarkable things I think that's particularly important for this conversation is that we also have not only the ability to kind of learn and absorb passively from our environment, but we have the ability to make a choice, right? For a top-down regulation and decision in terms of how we are going to engage and how we are going to think. It's hard and it takes a lot of effort, but we get a choice in how we repair our own hurts and nervous systems based on principles of synaptic plasticity. Because ultimately, it's the structures and how the structures communicate with us that determine and drive kind of the behaviors that we're able to produce. Specifically then in the context of early nervous system development, right? We have this developing brain, these neurons, 86 billion neurons, 86 billion glial cells that are all coming online around the time of birth and going through this massive proliferative experience. And because we are mammals, attachment, our early attachment, the ways in which we are cared for early in life, form some of the most foundational synapses, foundational connections in our brain that carry us through our entire lifetime. So attachment creates, in the literature with young children, it's talked about as serve and return, right? So baby does something and expects someone to be paying attention, right? Because we don't survive without people taking care of us, right? So baby serves something up and caregiver returns that thing. And in that moment, right, we have massive release of oxytocin, we have synchronization, right? So across here, we have parents. We synchronize our behaviors then. We synchronize gaze, we synchronize affect, right? So how we feel, our actual physiology. Isn't that so crazy? I remember when I first learned that, I was like, wait, what? So like if caregiver is super, super stressed and their heart rate is up and they go to tend to baby, baby senses that and baby's heart rate gets jacked up and baby feels stressed, except baby doesn't have all the cognitive framework and understanding about like emails and work responsibilities and all these things. Baby's just like, oh gosh, we're scared right now, right? Conversely, if caregiver goes and caregiver has the ability to be like, ooh, right? Feeling stressed, I'm not going to bring this here, right? Then caregiver can work to help build a different stress response in baby, right? Because baby, even if baby, right? Because baby cries. If baby cries, that means baby's stressed. And so baby will respond to the physiology of primary caretaker in the way that it synchronizes heart rate, stress response, blood pressure, and even brain waves via this oxytocin exchange. This early experience kind of spills over then into how we understand future relationships, future partnerships, how we understand reciprocity and broader friendship and social cohesion, and even kind of coordinated community structures, right? This early attachment circuitry is what we have to fall back on to look towards, right? And again, we don't do this explicitly. This is all most of the time, right? Unless we end up in counseling, right? Most of the time, this is implicit processing, right? It's automatically, we populate kind of the activity of the neural architecture that exists in attachment systems, populates experiences and interactions with humans as we grow. So I think we're gonna get put into breakout rooms But here are the questions. And Sarah, you have the ability to chat these out, yeah?
Yep, I will send a link to a doc in case you want to like save the doc, everyone, and I'll put the questions in the chat too.
Okay. So this is just to help us build a common definition of what these species expectant experiences are, right? And so if we think about infants, if we think about what infants can do and what they need from the world to survive, right? That is kind of the framework that I would ask you to think about in terms of species expectant experience, right? They expect what from the world around them, and this language and this interaction and exchange builds what kind of neural architecture for them to use later on in life. And then once you kind of come up with that list, the second question is, kind of what deviations from neurobiological expectation can produce? So, right, this is what the nervous system expects. What does deprivation look like? What does threat look like on the backdrop of that kind of that expected experience? What questions do we have before we go into the breakout rooms? Okay, awesome. Sarah, I'll get you guys into breakout rooms. We'll take maybe about 3 to 5 minutes in the breakout rooms.
Let me just
No problem.
give me 1 second. All right, so rooms will open. Please join your breakout room when you see the message.
So I was able to catch up on the chat when you guys were all in your breakout rooms. No, there's not going to be a quiz on the big words. Just sometimes people like to hear the big words, right? The take home is that you they take away the meaning, right? The feeling, the understanding, like no quiz on the big words. And they are hard questions, right? Because we don't really think about this. And our culture, right? In terms of cultural narratives and social norms, this is not something that we are encouraged or rewarded to think about culturally, right? Like we hear suck it up, and we hear it happens to everybody, and we hear put your big kid pants on. You know, like these are not things that we as a culture tend to want to or be encouraged to think about, right? And the danger in that is that it continues to perpetuate harm at increasing levels, because we can always say, well, it happened to me, you should be okay too, right? So what do we come up with? Species expectant, what is a developing nervous system? What does the developing nervous system want? What does it expect from the world? I'll bring the chat up. You can unmute yourself, or you can chat stuff, whatever you're more comfortable with. Response. Yep. It wants the world to respond to it, and likely in like an affectionate kind of way, right? Basic needs met and understood. Consistency. Yep. What else?
Correct response. So that kind of mirroring.
Yeah, right. And so go ahead, I'm sorry.
And understoodness.
Yeah, this idea of being seen, which again is being seen and being acknowledged and feeling that we matter, right? And so a lot of these things, we can be consistent, but we can be consistent in a really negative way. And so really what I want everybody to be able to take home from this portion of it is that species expectant experiences really are consistency in attentiveness, right? Consistency in love and compassion and care, consistency in environmental complexity, right? The nervous system evolved in a rich sensory three-dimensional world, and that is built into also the expectations, and we'll get into sensitive periods in a little bit, right? These periods of rapid development where the nervous system is expecting all this activity from the world around it. And the level of activity and the quality of activity during those sensitive periods determine the basic neural framework, that basic neural architecture upon which the rest of the experience is built over the course of a lifetime. Okay, so not only complexity in three-dimensional sensory environments, but also complexity in social environments, right? Humans, for the vast majority of human history, have lived in multi-generational households, in very, very close-knit neighborhoods. And that was essential for the survival of humans for the vast majority, right? We couldn't order Martin's to go or Martin's delivery, right? Like, we had to get our food with the help of other people over the course of the year ad nauseum, millennia after millennia, right? And so what you guys, so a lot of this, right? A lot of this expectation is captured in how we describe some of these best moments of childhood. And that's not to say that every day is sunshine and roses, because it's not, right? That's not the way that life works. But if we can keep in our hearts what this feels like, this is really the expectation of that developing nervous system. And really, right, we never outgrow this need for attachment and this need for social belonging. So this really is the expectation in terms of what should be happening. More than not, we should have this sense of safety and security in the world from the people around us. Okay? So what'd you guys come up with the deviations from this expectation, right? What does deprivation look like? You guys are worse than my class. What's deprivation look like?
Our team talked about high anxiety. The stress level is very high.
Yeah, in the chat, someone said anxiety, uncertainty, fear.
In our room, we said that sometimes it just, what's wrong comes out in behavior. And so thinking of like bad behavior maybe, or what we might consider bad behavior, seeing that as communication. That something's wrong.
Yeah.
Talked about maybe having new connections that are forming as bad habits very early on. Fear and things like that.
Okay.
Another
All right.
chat comment. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Another chat comment is lack of mirroring and presence of high stress behaviors in the caretakers.
Lack of touch, warm, nurturing touch.
Yep, you got it. Yep. And so we've got a lot of really good things. So lack of mirroring behaviors, lack of kind of warm, nurturing touch, stress present in caretakers. And so that, and ultimately stress, uncertainty, and fear, right? When these expectations aren't met, when we are young, that is a threat to us. That is a threat to our survival, because our survival depends on the way that we are cared for. Our survival depends on this kind of responsive and caring attachment figure. So when there's a lack of that warm and caring attachment figure, it increases our stress. It results in a sense of internal fear and uncertainty. This physiological state then drives, right, that massive proliferation that occurs over the first 5 years of life, drives, right, this physiological state drives that proliferation, right? Because the brain's job, number one and foremost, is survival, right? The brain, in terms of synaptic formation, the connections that are forming in the brain, there's no value judgment in those, right? This brain is thinking, okay, well, nobody's paying attention to me. Well, how do, right? What's wrong comes out in behaviors. How do I get what I need from this environment? Well, if my cries aren't working, right? Maybe if I'm a little older and my cries and my words aren't working, maybe I'm going to hit somebody so that I can get somebody to pay attention to me, right? Now, if that's not going to work, maybe I can just take what I need from somebody else because otherwise I don't know how I'm going to get what I need, right? And again, because the brain's number one job is survival, right? So much of this, the environmental exchange drives synaptic proliferation. Okay? So those are great things. So threat and deprivation, we want to think about those. They don't exist very often in isolation, but they do, right, in terms of the way that the brain would develop in a deprived environment versus a threat environment. Those are distinct neurobiological states. Okay. So let's take a couple minutes. You don't have to share anything specifically that happened, but think about some of the worst memories of childhood, right? And you can recall internally what was happening and how it felt. But what I want us to consider, and what I ask you to have the courage to share out, is what was the expectation, like, right? That's a terrible, terrible memory. And it hurt so much because the expectation was X and I got Y, right?
Coming into a situation where someone's talking about you and they're unaware that you're there. Just the uncertainty that that causes.
Yep, so this idea of talking about you kind of behind your back.
Right.
Yep, absolutely. Well, because again, the expectation, this is generally hurtful when it comes from somebody that we have a relationship with, right? Like it's, you feel uncertain if you walk into a room and you don't know people and somehow you're the subject of conversation. That's unsettling, but it hurts when this happens from people that we care about, because the expectation is one of trust and mutual respect and care. And the violation then is the disrespect and the lack of care, right? How do we socialize this? What do we tell people?
Can't say it to their face, don't say it at all.
Can't say it to their face, don't say it at all. That would be a great response, absolutely. What are some other, not necessarily the memories, but if you would be willing to share feeling of betrayal and how it reset the relationship? Yeah, betrayal. Right? Because when we have, actually, since, I don't know if you guys read in the newspaper, Father Jenkins was at the Rose Garden this last weekend and he was unmasked. Mm-hmm. Talk about, right? It's a ripple of betrayal across campus, because here is this leader that we have, right? And so this is a great example of attachment circuitry. This attachment circuitry spills out over even into people that we don't have relationship with. So this sense of in-group belonging, we will appoint certain roles and place trust even in the absence of a relationship because of certain in-group belonging, right? And so in the situation with Father Jenkins, he has been one who said for months and months and months and months, and we have all these policies, and the students, I tell you, right, we thought we were going to get shut down 2 weeks into campus. This student population has done everything, and they've kept us on campus, right? Is the actions of the students that have been responsible for this. First of all, nobody's talking about that in the media, so that's unfortunate. Got all kinds of bad press at the beginning of the year, and nobody's commending these students for all of the things that they've done for the last 8 weeks to keep us there. And then Father Jenkins, right? And so it is a sense of betrayal, right? And it sends this massive kind of depression across the nervous system. And an apology doesn't fix that. Right? So in terms of the way that synapses change, right? We have a lot of excitement, a lot of really strong synaptic connections, a lot of really strong brain activity. We feel so good when we're in places where we're with people that we care about and who care about us, right? And then, right, when we break that expectant contract, right? Our arm's not cut off. We didn't lose a leg, right? Like we're not physically injured, but it hurts, right? And a lot of that there's a sweeping wave of what's called synaptic depression, right? So the nervous system really only cares about differences. And so if we go from a state in which we feel safe and belong, strong sense of belonging, and then we have an experience that's way out of alignment with what the nervous system expects, there's this massive press down, boom, across the nervous system. And that's what is kind of perceived as this kind of sense of hurt or betrayal. It's the distance between the expectation and then how that expectation was violated, right? So usually the closer the relationship, the more those violations tend to hurt. Right? Mm-hmm.
We've got some more in the chat. Being left behind by adults who I expected to take me home. Another example was big kids knocked me off my bicycle and sent me back to where I came from. And then a comment about maybe this is why we can say, like in a situation, you might say, I can't forget, but maybe we can forgive.
Yeah, right. And so I think that last part is a really good, I would like us to hold on to that, right? Because I think the forgiveness enters into healing, right? Because violation, so deprivation, all of these things. Yes, every single person has, right? It's not that life is perfect. Every single person on this call, every single person that you will ever talk to will have experience with hurt, will have experience with those expectations not being met. But that is not the end, right? We luckily get to talk about resilience at the end of this. And resilience is that combination. It's the hurt, right? Because life is not perfect, but it's the combination of the hurt with that strong supportive structure that makes us, that creates the synaptic diversity that's required for resilience. So species expectant experiences create the baseline synaptic architecture for all of the stuff, right? They create the baseline synaptic architecture for long-term motivation, for feelings of reward, for motivation, for reinforcement, for social belonging, for social flexibility, right? And if we start to whittle away at those experiences in situations of deprivation or threat, we can start to think about how it changes the way that neurobiology develops. So, Sarah, was this a breakout room? I don't think we had a breakout room so soon. I don't think it was. Okay.
Do you want to have one now, or?
I don't know. Do you guys want to go back to breakout room? Talk about these things? No? Okay. All right. So how is it? So I think the question is, right? So we just talked about distance, right? So there's the expectation and there's a violation of the expectation. And the distance between that kind of creates the magnitude of the hurt in the central nervous system, right? And so what I want us to also be thoughtful about is how have social rules changed in the past few generations around the way that we treat children, around the priorities of placing care on children, right? How these social rules exist at a distance from what the expectant experiences are of the developing nervous system, right? Because none of us were born at the start of mankind, right? Can we all agree to that? None of us were around at the dawn of time, right? We are all born into social systems that already exist. We're all born into families that already have a long history of how they reward and how they punish and how they engage and how they, put people to bed at nighttime, if they put people to bed, like all of those things. Those social rules exist, and those social rules are shaped by how culture changes. And culture changes at a pace that far exceeds the way that the developing nervous system can change, right? In terms of the evolutionary pace of changing the neurobiological expectations, right? I remember doing a talk a couple years ago, and it was somehow, of course, devices and media use came up in kids, right? And this was specifically about like toddlers and infants. And I was like, it's just, right? Because talk about distance, right? It's a two-dimensional space. It's non-interactive. There's no sensory input besides this rapid, bright light. And the response was, well, it was 2018. Well, it's 2018. What do you expect? Like, you can't expect it to be different. But the question that I would offer is that, like, first of all, why not? Because if we want things to be better for our kids, right, we have to do what's right for our kids, not what's easy for us, right? And that's a big ask, right? Because in terms of social rules, kind of these normative social and cultural things, what is it, what kind of parent are you in the PTO? Like, how does the PTO talk about you as the parent if your kid doesn't get a device, or if your kid's not on, I don't know, Roblox, Facebook, Messenger, TikTok, right? Like there's a lot of social pressure to conform, even if you know that it's perhaps not ideal for the health of the developing nervous system. So we have to be honest about those social factors in this conversation if we want to consider different opportunities to care for developing nervous systems.
Nancy, I got a question in the chat that kind of fits in. Someone asked if this is specific to American culture, or is this more broad? Like, is it, would you say it's human nature? Like, how does that specifically?
Which is the this?
I'm not sure. Maybe this came from Tom. So maybe Tom, you could ask the question.
Yeah, when you were talking before about the human nature of things, I was just wondering, or the cultural nature, I guess you were talking about culture. Is the research the same for around the world studies, or is this primarily United States studies, and different cultures do have different ways that their brains react just because of their social systems and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I would say human brains in general, in terms of needs for, right, oxytocin systems are going to be present in humans around the globe. Dopamine systems and reward systems are going to be present in humans around the globe. Social rules, how we respect and look towards our elders, are very, very different culturally, right? And so attentional systems do develop differently. The vast majority of human research on things like attention, cognitive systems, those are horrendously biased by undergraduates in the United States of America. I guarantee you, 18 to 22-year-old college-educated students, they're not the typical brains if you look at the 7.5 billion people around the world. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. But in terms of like globally, 7.5 billion people around the world absolutely need to be strongly attached to people. Otherwise, we induce vulnerabilities into the developing nervous system that make us far more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, those kinds of things.
So since I'm on a roll, I've got one more question. If I
Okay,
could.
ready.
So the social that you're talking about changes, even in the United States, when you're talking about kids, there's probably been a difference in the last 50, 60 years of how we raise kids from a discipline standpoint.
Yep.
I mean, in schools, you take a kid to the office and spank them, and you're going to prison now, and 50 years ago you didn't. You got applauded because you used a paddle with holes in it. So is there been enough time in the way we raise our kids through discipline or expectations for us to see any kind of shift in the kids' physiology?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that there are definitely studies on like corporal punishment and stuff. And corporal punishment, when it's unpredictable, hang on just one second. Thanks, parenting. So there are studies on corporal punishment and stress physiology and how that affects kind of relationship status and things like that, right? And so my understanding of these studies is that when it's not, so most abuse, to my understanding, happens kind of right in this kind of fear, uncertainty realm, right? Where it's much more an unpredictable stressor. And that is where you absolutely see negative impact of it. Studies on, anyway, we'll talk more offline. Okay. All right, so in terms of deprivation, right? Deprivation kind of removes or destabilizes. Deprivation as a discrete unit removes or destabilizes this kind of the human expectations of normative attachment. So there's either no consistence or no attentiveness in the attachment figure, limited environmental complexity, diminished or missing serve and return experiences, as I do something but nobody responds idea, diminished or impoverished language exchange, because even language learning requires this serve and return interaction, stationary or two-dimensional environments, and these diminished or impoverished social environments, right? Kind of again, removing the expectation or creating a distance between what the species expectant experience is and increasing the distance to what it actually is. And what this does over time then, so remember, we think about, let me see if I can find the slide super quick. Here we go. So we think about this, right? We think about this massive, massive, massive proliferation that occurs during the first many, many years of life that has to do with the structure of the neuron that generates the function of the neural circuit. And what we see in children that grow up in what we consider kind of deprived environments or experience deprivation during their early years is you actually see measurable differences in cortical thickness. So that outer layer of the brain that looks a lot like spaghetti is actually thinner in all of these areas that we call association areas, right? So this is not how we move our bodies, but this is how we integrate sensory experience into creating our motor movements. This is how we listen to and understand not only word choice, but so much of meaning is carried by not only word choice, but also tone, the rhythm of speech, the intonation, and kind of the melodic nature of speech. All of that ability, the critical thinking, creative thinking, exploratory behaviors, all of that the brain neural real estate that's responsible for what we call associative, right? I'm going to take some visual input and I'm going to take some memories and I'm going to mix them together to come up with something else. That's association cortex. Those regions of the brain become thinned, right? And it's not that they become thinned, but they don't have the opportunity to go through that proliferative process to thicken up to begin with, right? That's what deprivation does. Okay. Threat, again, exists as a different neural representation. So deprivation is the absence. Threat is the presence of something that is dangerous to my well-being. We talked about this last week, so we'll go through this a little bit more quickly, right? But threat, oh my gosh, there's a scorpion, right? It activates, there's a sensory input that we've learned to be dangerous to our health and well-being. It activates the fight or flight response. They're the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So there's a stressor, here we go. This is the fight or flight response, ultimately results in the secretion of cortisol, right? Historically, evolutionarily, stressors are acute. Oh my gosh, there's a tiger, right? 20 minutes, you're gonna be gone from the tiger or you're gonna be lunch, but either way, the event is done and it's past, right? So the way that the stress response evolved is in a negative feedback loop where once cortisol enters the bloodstream, it takes about 20 minutes for that cortisol to circle back. Then it talks to a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory in the brain. Hippocampus then shuts down the stress response, turns it off. In cases of chronic stress, right, prolonged chronic stressors, this negative feedback loop becomes broken because the stress response never gets turned off. We have continually elevating levels of cortisol that circulate in the bloodstream so that the hippocampus, instead of when cortisol gets back to the hippocampus shutting the stress response down, the hippocampus actually starts to kind of decay, right? It suffers from, goes through atrophy because the chronic presence of stress hormones begin to deconstruct that neural, right? Like the basic structure of neurons starts to atrophy and shrivel, right? So that's why when we think about chronic stressors, right? We all have stress throughout our daily lives, fluctuations, and we all manage these things very, very well, generally speaking. It is a normal part of human behavior and function, right? But when stress gets too much, or when stress gets too frequent, it puts an additional load on the physiological system. And the literature talks about this as allostatic load, right? So homeostasis is a very narrow range. We always use the example of like a thermostat, right? I'm gonna set my heater on 68 in the wintertime. It gets too cold, the heater kicks on. It gets too hot, the air conditioning kicks on. Allostasis is a lot more flexible. There's a lot more range in allostasis and in allostatic load. But in these situations of chronic stress, that load starts to break down the physiology across the system. We live in highly complex environments, right? And so typically environments are low threat and low deprivation. But you can see, right, high deprivation, institutionalization, neglect, poverty kind of stretches the gamut of low deprivation, low threat to high deprivation, high threat. Physical, sexual abuse, right? Those become immediate stress or immediate threats to our immediate well-being. So again, it's really, really hard. And again, often these things are intertwined, right? Generally speaking, somebody who might experience one would experience multiple. Okay. All right. So what does this mean then in the context of sensitive periods? Early on in development, we have this massive proliferation, and the expectation is one of consistent care from the world around us. So we read this the other day. I'll read it again because it's kind of really important, right? So the organization of the brain, right, that synaptic proliferation, that massive, massive arborization, is particularly sensitive to a domain-specific stimuli for a limited period of time. So something like visual input, tactile input, taste, auditory input, or attachment, right? Attachment is a much longer window. Exposure to the same stimulus, either before or after that sensitive window, is either ineffective at inducing organizational change, or more often is markedly blunted, right? So if we miss that window, there's tremendous remediation that has to occur, okay? There is no way for the nervous system to judge good or bad, right? The nervous system doesn't have that ability. Neurons do not have a value judgment about good or bad synapses. Stress response is going to be driven, the development of the synaptic architecture that underlies the stress response is going to be driven by the responsiveness of care and the physiology of the individual who's providing that care. Then, right, so out of this sense of attachment, we develop then our internal locus of control. And agency, again, is another thing that we socialize as something that's not important. We make it a joke of so many things. But internal locus of control is the essence of agency, is the root of our self-worth, our self-efficacy, our competency. All of the ways that we feel like we are of value to the world arise from this internal locus of control that is established by the way that we are cared for as children. Just to reiterate, we learn not from what people say, but from what people do. We learn from how we are treated. And when there is a distance, right? What is the expectation? What is the experience? When there's a distance, it begins to hurt us. Synapses that fire together, wire together. Just to reiterate from the book, children have a neurobiological need to attach. They have no choice. We don't get a choice into the families and the environments or any of those things that we're born into. We have to attach because as mammals, we do not survive outside of infancy, beyond, without attaching to whoever is around to care for us. Terror increases the need for attachment. even if the source of comfort is also the source of terror. We have no choice. We have no agency. We have no resources as children. We have to attach. And I've never met a child below the age of 10 who was tortured at home, who, if given the option, would not have chosen to stay with his or her family. We don't have a choice. So we develop in an environment in which we have this chronic stress dose delivery. And over time, then, as we age, we develop the higher likelihood, right? It's correlative. It is not causal, but the higher the stress dose in our earlier years. So the ACEs study was a seminal study that looked at adversity in childhood and health outcomes later in life. It was the first study to do so. And what the study really demonstrated was that in individuals that had low ACE scores or adverse childhood experiences, had 0 adverse childhood experiences by the study, the percentage with health problems was very low. Only about 5% of those individuals as adults had health problems. As you increase the number of events that these individuals experienced, right, increasing the stress dose to their developing nervous systems, right? Because when we have an expectation of attachment and that attachment is not met, that is stressful to us because it threatens our capacity to survive. If we have a threat that we have to live with that jeopardizes our safety in our home, right? That is stressful because our safety, right? It's different than deprivation, but it threatens our safety in the same, right, physiologically in similar ways. So as the stress dose, number of adverse childhood experiences increase, the likelihood of health problems later on in life also increases. So this will be our last breakout session. We'll take 3 minutes and want you to study this graph. So population attributable risk is an epidemiological term, right? So it looks at the entire population and then it says, okay, in a population with 0 ACEs, how common is this thing? So let's look at alcohol or binge drinking. In a population without ACEs, alcohol or binge drinking is reasonably common. If we look at the population with ACEs, right, how much more common is it? So we can attribute 32.5% of binge drinking can be attributed to experience with ACEs during childhood. Tobacco use, 36.7% of tobacco use can be attributed to experience with ACEs in childhood. 67% of suicides can be attributed to experience with ACEs during childhood. And so my question for you is like, why or how? Like how, so thinking about all the things that we talked about, species expectant experiences, distance from those, what is it about the distance and or the physiological response that might increase the likelihood of these events occurring later on in life? Is that mission for the breakout rooms clear? What questions do we have?
I pasted the question in the chat, so you should be able to see that in your breakout room, and it's also in the doc. Everybody ready?
All right.
Okay. And how long are we in this one for?
Pretty short because I want to make sure we're done on time. So maybe like 2 minutes we'll be in the breakout rooms. 2.5 minutes.
All right, here you go.
Okay.
Nancy,
Yes.
is there another way? In our group, the question just feels complicated. Is there another way the question could be worded or broken into pieces so that we could think through it differently?
Probably. I'll think about it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to come up with that on the fly right now, but I'll think about it. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure there is. All right. So any here, we'll do that. What do you guys come up with?
Well, I wasn't in a group, but my thought would be, if you don't have kind of internal ways to control your stress, maybe you're looking for, thinking of alcohol, drug use, you're looking for outside ways to control your stress and anxiety if you haven't learned that.
Yeah, absolutely, right? It ultimately all comes down to stress response, right? And so with a chronic stress response, cortisol, right? Cortisol is considered something, it's called something, a glucocorticoid. Cortisol, it's a stress hormone. Chronic doses of that, our physiology doesn't know how to handle cortisol on board all the time. We do need it around. It's really, really important for normal function, but it can't handle it chronically. And so when cortisol is around, it shifts physiological function at the level of the cell, not only in the physiology, like the heart and the liver and the islet cells of the pancreas, but also in the brain and in the hippocampus, right? So that we not only seem to use substances as a means of stress management, but we also end up seeing increased risks of actual disease like cancer and cardiovascular disease, asthma, diabetes, because of this persistent pressure that cortisol puts on the actual cells and physiology, right? And ACEs themselves don't necessarily exist at the individual level, right? ACEs can exert, we can have community ACEs, adverse community environments in which the stress of the community environment exerts a similar influence on stress systems and function. But here's the thing that is the most important to remember, is that the single most important predictive factor for resiliency and success is you, right? Is every single one of us has the capacity to live into the neurobiological expectation of attachment for anybody that we come across. We all have that capacity. And again, the distance between kind of like the social norming and the way that we feel compelled to engage sometimes, that can be a great distance. So how can we start to ask ourselves, how can we show up differently so that we can be better agents for our children and for our community? This is one of my favorite quotes. Alice Walker, as a playwright and activist, the most common way people give up their power is thinking they don't have any, right? Because what can I possibly do? I'm just one person. But we each control our own narratives, and we can make a huge impact just in shifting the way that we show up. See, right there, I see it. Just in shifting the way that we show up, we can make a huge impact on that locus of control, that sense of agency for another person by showing up in the way that meets a neurobiological expectation. Because resilience is not about life being perfect. Resilience is understanding that life is really, really hard, but I've got you. And you are not in this alone. We are in this together. And I will do everything I know how to do to make it better. It is not about it being perfect. It's about not letting each other down anymore. Right? And that's kind of the big ask, right? And all of this, the whole, right, why we decided to extend out this book club. This is a quote from the book. Our great challenge is to apply the lessons of neuroplasticity, the flexibility of brain circuits, to rewire the brains and reorganize the minds of people who have been programmed by life itself to experience others as threats and themselves as helpless. Because that is ultimately what adversity does in the absence of strong support. Social support is a biological necessity. It is not an option no matter how old we get. And this reality should be the backbone for all prevention and treatment. We neglect it and negate it at every pass because we are not socialized in this country to believe, right? We're independent, we're entrepreneurial. We are not socialized culturally to believe that we should need anyone. We often point to needing somebody as a sign of weakness, but is a neurobiological necessity. So please consider joining us over the next couple of weeks to learn more about self-healing communities, to learn more about what's already happening in our community in ways that we're taking the evidence of neuroscience and epigenetics and ACEs and resilience and implementing evidence-based change in the form of trauma-informed care across organizations. A lot of them we can all be involved in, we can all volunteer at. So please consider joining us. And thank you guys so much for taking the time out of family time to come back tonight. I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So our next session, next Tuesday, will be about trauma and mental health in our community. So we have several guests from education, healthcare, community mental health. We'll be talking about what they've seen on the local presence of trauma and the impact of their trauma-informed responses. So we hope you can join us. Thanks so much for being here tonight. Thank you again to Dr. Michael for that very informative and interesting presentation. And yeah, have a great night.
Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great night, everybody.